In this talk, we will learn how species are defined, with an emphasis on the biological species concept. Species is the last taxonomic group used in the classification of living organisms. The taxonomy begins with the taxon domain, followed by kingdom and phylum. We then have the subphylum, class, and order. And then this is followed by the family, genus, and finally the species. Species can be considered as an evolutionarily independent group of organisms. When we look at the etymology of the word species, the literal meaning of species is kind or appearance. There are many definitions that have been put forth to define the word species, and one of the popular definitions is based on the biological species concept. According to the biological species concept, the species are a group of organisms whose members are capable of interbreeding with one another, but are reproductively isolated from the members of other species. In this definition, reproductive isolation indicates that the organism is not able to breed with members of other species. Based on the definition of the biological species concept, it is worthwhile to take a moment to think about our own species. Humans can be found in different geographical locations around the world and look different. They have different cultures as well as linguistic differences. But despite all of these differences, we all belong to the same species of Homo sapiens. And hence, in the biological sense, we are all equal despite the diversity that we see amongst each other, which should be considered as a strength. The biological species concept emphasizes that the members of one species cannot breed and hence are reproductively isolated from the members of another species. And hence, there are reproductive isolating mechanisms that are present between or among species that prevents gene exchange between members that are of different species. There are different types of reproductive isolating mechanisms, and they come under the realm of prezygotic isolating mechanisms and postzygotic isolating mechanisms. Prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms are those mechanisms that do not allow the formation of a zygote. Prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms can occur due to different factors, which include ecological isolation of species, behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, mechanical isolation, or gametic isolation. Let us first look at ecological isolation. In these scenarios, the members of two species do not breed with one another because they are present in different habitats altogether, and hence they never meet with one another. Since they don't meet with one another, they will not be breeding with one another. Behavioral isolation is another type of prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanism. In this case, the members of one species indulge in behaviors that is appealing to the members of only those species, but not as appealing to members of other species. For example, birds tend to sing certain types of songs that are appealing to the opposite sex of their species, but not to the opposite sex of other species. The same is true to the dance of the peacock. The peacock is known to have these beautiful feathers, and it dances to attract the peahen. However, this dance is not considered as appealing to the female birds of other species. Another type of prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanism is temporal isolation. In this scenario, the mating between the members of one species occurs at a different time than the matings between the members of another species. Since mating is happening at different times of the year, the two different species will not interbreed with one another. Mechanical isolation is a type of prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanism where members of different species have different reproductive structures, and hence there is incompatibility between the reproductive structures. Thus, the members belonging to the different species are unable to mate because of these differences in their reproductive structures. In the case of gametic isolation, we have a situation where the members of two different species are able to mate. However, the gametes are unable to fuse with one another to form a zygote. This could be because the proteins that are needed for the fusion of the different gametes are not present, among other types of mechanisms that do not allow the gametes to fuse. Thus, there are many different types of prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms that do not allow the formation of a zygote. In the event that two species are able to mate and their gametes are able to fuse to form a hybrid zygote, there can be postzygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms that do not allow that hybrid zygote to develop into its own organism, or if that does happen, then the resulting organism could be sterile. Hence, when we look at the different types of postzygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms, the first one that we're going to look at is hybrid inviability. In this case, zygote formation does happen. However, the resulting zygote is not viable because it is unable to develop. It is unable to develop most probably because of the incompatibility among the genomes of the two gametes that were from different species. Another type of postzygotic reproductive isolating mechanism is hybrid sterility. In this case, the zygote that is formed from the gametes of two different species is able to develop. However, the resulting organism, which is also a hybrid, is sterile, and hence it is unable to bear any progeny of its own. Another type of postzygotic reproductive isolating mechanism is hybrid breakdown. In this case, a hybrid zygote is formed from the gametes of two different species. This hybrid zygote is able to develop to form an organism. This hybrid organism is in fact fertile. However, the fertility drops as the successive generations proceed. Usually, in the case of hybrid breakdown, after 2 generations, the resulting progeny is unable to reproduce their own kind, and hence there is no further generations that are formed. The biological species concept emphasizes on the ability of members of one species to breed with one another, but not with the members of other species. This emphasis on breeding results in some limitations of the biological species concept. For example, scientists have observed successful interbreeding in some organisms that have been assigned to different species. Another example where a limitation of the biological species concept is evident is the assumption that when organisms are geographically separated, they are not able to interbreed. This may not be the case because if these organisms were brought in the same vicinity, they may have the ability to breed and give rise to viable progeny that have the ability to breed for successive generations. The biological species concept is difficult to apply to those organisms that do not need a mate for reproduction. There are many organisms that go through asexual modes of reproduction, like prokaryotic organisms. Additionally, there are some other more complex organisms that are hermaphrodites, and hence they have both male and female reproductive structures. Thereby, they don't need a mate in order for reproduction to occur. Due to the limitations imposed by the biological species concept, there have been other definitions of species. One such definition is the phylogenetic species concept, which defines a species as a group of organisms with a shared and unique evolutionary history. Another type of definition of species is through the ecological species concept. In this scenario, a species is defined as a group of organisms that are adapted to a particular set of resources in the environment, which is called as a niche. In addition to these concepts, there have been other concepts that have been put forward by different scientists. With this, we come to the end of our talk, where we learned that species is the last taxon in the classification of living organisms. We also learned about the definition of species based on the biological species concept, and looked into different pre-zygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms as well as post-zygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms. We also learned about the limitations of the biological species concept and looked at other definitions of species.